So yesterday we had a chance to look at a Buster Brown comic that actually had some narration to it, and we saw an example of the Katzenjammer Kids. Now we will look at a later example of the Katzenjammer Kids, or Hans und Fritz, and a different comic. But first, let's look in the Encyclopedia of Comics and look at the next page in their introduction. Here we have an example of Judge Rummy, Silk Cat Harry's divorce suit, 1920. I am not at all familiar with this, and I must confess this is very difficult to read. It is a very small writing. I'm sure the original was larger, but it seems to be an ongoing story of funny animals, so animals that live like people, like Mickey Mouse. One thing I've noticed about earlier forms of writing is that people either had really, really good handwriting or not so good handwriting. So that's why we would have beautiful handwriting like in Buster Brown, and then perhaps not such a good writing here. So this seems to be part of an ongoing story where a judge goes missing and there are shenanigans. On the next page, we have a famous Terry and the Pirates example, and I say famous because here at the bottom, Milton Caniff, Terry and the Pirates, 1943, the famous page reprinted in the Congressional Record. The same page, or maybe just part of it, was reprinted in the book The History of the Funnies that I've discussed in previous weeks. And basically, it's a pep talk about you may be a flyboy, but don't forget about all of the engineers who built the plane and the people who created the bullets and the fuel. And basically, everybody works together for our country. And of course, this was made during the war, 1943. One thing I noticed is on the last panel, this way to Tokyo, Tokio. It's interesting to see how foreign names become naturalized over time. There are, of course, many ways to transliterate different languages, and sometimes different transliteration schemes exist for a while with different ways to anglicize pronunciation. So nowadays, of course, we spell that with a Y instead of an O. It's a little bit like how, when I was a child, the capital of China was Peking, and now it is Beijing. And there are some complicated reasons for that. But anyway, let's look at this next example. So we're going to look at number 7 and number 8 in the Smithsonian Book of Newspaper Comics. Now we saw an early version of the Katzenjammer Kids from 1911. Now here is one from 1913. Now you'll notice here there's a different title. It's no longer the Katzenjammer Kids. It's Hans und Fritz by the same person, the originator of the Katzenjammer Kids. And the reason is because the newspaper owned the comic strip, and so when the artist creator was lured to a different newspaper, he could still keep the characters, but he had to give the strip a different name. So there were two different Katzenjammer strips going on at the same time. Actually, I think at one time there were even 3. That's sort of like once when there were a couple of different popes at the same time. Copyright laws and comic strips have had a very bad relationship in the past. And some of that we see not only 100 years ago, but even today. If you hear news about Comicsgate, a lot of that has to do with creator rights. But anyway, this cartoon, apparently Mama has a boarding house, and here a violent cowboy comes to the boarding house. He wants supper, so he's shooting up the place. It's a little bit like Bluto coming into town, and Popeye has to take justice to his own hands. In this case, the boys happen to have a fully working cannon, which they dress up as a man, and then they use the cannon to shoot at this wild horse and this cowboy so that they can have peace in their boarding house. So once again, we see a 3x4 format, just like we had seen in earlier comics. The camera is basically at the same angle the whole time, and a lot of things happen in between panels. I mean, you could tell the same story, but in 20 or 30 panels, really, because there's a lot of motion that's been implied. There's a good deal of text, too. It is difficult to read. It was much larger originally, but it is difficult for me to read even in this large form, but I think we got understood the story. Next we have Maud by Fred Oper, 1905. I am not familiar with this comic at all, but it does seem to be a good example of slapstick at that time. So we have a donkey listening to a Victrola, comic supplement of the Boston American. Now I'm not entirely sure, but I think some newspapers had comics printed separately and then just sort of stuffed into their newspapers. I know that's how The Spirit by Eisner was printed for many years, and I kind of think this was done for other newspapers also, but I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, we have, I suppose, a farmer and his donkey, and the cyclone comes and just sort of tosses them around, and it's very slapsticky. In this case, we only have 9 panels, and it's a very beautifully drawn. You can see the line work is very intricate. We see that a lot with cartooning of this time period. Edwardian and Victorian drawings tended to be elaborate prints like that. So anyway, tomorrow we can look at Happy Hooligan, 1905, and Jimmy from 1915. And I'll talk to you next time. Goodbye.